Welcome, good morning or good afternoon, good evening, perhaps, depending on where you are in the world. I know the wonderful thing about these webinars is that they can be global events, which is wonderful. But I wanted to talk to you. Well, first of all, I should introduce myself. For those of you that don't know me, I know some of you do. My name's Martin Lill, and I've been working with Lakeland Industries for just over 20 years now. And I've been in the PPE business, specifically in protective clothing, largely chemical protective clothing, for just over 30 years. So I ought to know something about it by now. I think if I don't know something about it, there'd be something wrong. And I want to talk to you specifically about a particular type of situation that I have concerns about the way it's handled, about the way that standards deal with it, and yet is quite a very common situation. And it is specifically, one second, it is specifically this situation. It's where you need both flame and heat protection or flash fire protection and chemical protection at the same time. So I want to talk about this issue, and my objective here is that by the end of the session, I will have convinced you of three things. First of all, that where you have this situation, unfortunately, the existing PPE standards, or at least until very recently, the existing PPE standards fail to address it. They don't really deal with the situation properly. But there is a new US standard, which whether you are in the USA or anywhere else, is worth being aware of, and if not following, applying its principles. And thirdly, I'd like to convince you that there are some secondary FR garments available in the market at the moment, garments which appear to be FR, but in fact, if you look closely, they are certainly not what you may think they are. So that's the three things I would like you to take away from this session today. So you can judge me at the end of the 30 minutes or so on that basis. I'm going to start by talking briefly about standards in general, PPE standards, because standards undoubtedly have been a good thing. EN standards were first introduced in 1995. I remember the amount of work involved. It seemed shocking at the time, the work involved in making sure products met those initial standards in 1995, but they have undoubtedly been a good thing. In the last few decades, there has undoubtedly been an improvement in workplace safety. Fewer accidents and hazards are dealt with in a more effective way because of standards. However, standards are not perfect. And one of the limitations I've felt for a long time about PPE standards, whether NFPA in the USA or EN in Europe or any other standards, is that they inevitably, I guess, tend to deal with hazards and with PPE in isolation, which is fine, except for that isn't what happens in the real world. In the real world, safety managers have to deal with multiple hazards at the same time. And very often, people have to wear different types of PPE for different hazards at the same time. And that can be a problem because you can never be certain, because standards deal with things largely in isolation. You can never be certain whether one type of PPE that you're wearing may affect another type of PPE adversely. And it's difficult to know that. And it's nowhere is this more common than in, I think, the oil and gas industry, and especially refining, petrochemical, where it is standard that you need FR protection. I've been on lots of chemical plants, petrochemical plants in the last 20 years, and in general, pretty much everywhere now, it is basic standard practice. There are a lot of the site, you won't get on the site unless you are wearing FR protection. And workers generally use a primary FR garment certified to EN 11612 in Europe and NFPA 2112 in North American standards. And that's standard pretty much everywhere. But then very often in lots of applications, you also need chemical protection, or perhaps not specifically chemical protection, but you might want to wear a disposable coverall over the primary FR workwear simply to keep it clean, because primary FR workwear can be expensive, laundering can be problematical and expensive, and of course laundering can degrade thermal protective properties over time. So you might want to lengthen the life of the garment by keeping it clean in dirty environments. So what happens too often is that people will take a standard chemical suit or a disposable coverall and they will put them together. They will wear that over the primary FR workwear. So you would think you've solved the problem. You've got both your primary FR protection and then over the top, you've got your chemical protection or your disposable coverall. Problem solved. Except it isn't. It isn't problem solved at all. In fact, it's problem created. Why? That's the question, why? The reason is because the fact is, pretty much all standard chemical suits and disposable coveralls are made of plastic. They're based on polymer fabrics, polymer fibers, generally polypropylene or polyethylene or a mix of both, and in the higher level chemical suits, various other types of polymer fabrics, but they are plastic. So that's a problem because you're wearing your primary FR garment for the protection against the risk of a flash fire, and you've got a disposable coverall over it. If you're engulfed in that flash fire, the purpose of the primary FR workwear is to give you that bit of protection so that you will survive that few seconds of that flash fire. Flash fires tend to be use up the fuel within 2 or 3 seconds, so they tend to be very short duration, and your primary FR workwear will give you that protection. However, if you're wearing a disposable coverall over it that's plastic, in those few seconds, the plastic will ignite and it will burn. And long after the flash fire has extinguished, it will continue to burn. And not only that, it's plastic, so it melts, it drips, it sticks onto the fabric of the primary FR workwear, and it continues long after the flash fire is extinguished to transfer heat energy through the fabric to your skin. Because that primary FR workwear is designed for the flash fire. It's not designed to protect you against something stuck to the fabric continuing to burn. So the result will be, almost inevitably, an increase in the burn as a result of that flash fire. So the fact is, wearing standard chemical or disposable clothing over primary FR clothing can seriously compromise thermal protection. And here's the thing, perhaps fatally. So that's the theory. But is it proven, you may ask? How do we know this? That is logical, but how do we know it? Well, in Lakeland, we've done testing in the past to prove this point because it's important. And the testing you can use to show it is thermal mannequin testing or predicted body burn testing. So some of you will know that the thermal mannequin test looks something like this. You have a thermal mannequin, which is a mannequin covered in 123 heat sensors. Each of those sensors absorbs heat energy at the same rate as skin. Then you put the coverall or the FR garment that you're testing over the mannequin, and you subject it to a flash fire from 4 burners around the equipment at a specific calorie energy level, and you will choose a burn length of 2, 3, or 4 seconds. 3 seconds is very common. And all those heat sensors are connected to a computer, and through that, I won't go into the mechanism, it's pretty complex, but this can then predict the body burn that would occur in that situation. So we've done tests, and here's a body map from one of the first tests we did. Each of those little areas on that map relates to one heat sensor, and the areas that are shaded orange are where it predicts there would be a burn. And in this case, the total predicted body burn was 37%, and there were second-degree burns only. And that test was done on a primary FR garment only. So that's our baseline test. That's the starting point for us to work from. The body burn that you get just wearing a primary FR garment. 37% second-degree burns only. So then we did another test. We took the same primary FR garment and we put it on the mannequin, and then over that, we put a standard disposable coverall. Polymer-based, this one was a polyethylene and polypropylene mix, and it's a pretty standard disposable coverall that's worn over the world. And this was the result of the same test. The body burn increased from 37% to 53%. Not only that, but you can see there are two different colours of shading. There's the orange, which is the second-degree burns, and the red, which are third-degree burns. So they are more critical burns. They're much deeper, they don't heal, they need skin grafts because the nerves are dead. So we've actually increased the burn injury substantially, but also we're getting deeper burns simply because we put the disposable coverall over the primary FR workwear. So that's the problem. There's the proof that you cannot wear standard disposable or chemical suits over primary FR workwear. You will compromise the thermal protection and possibly fatally. That 53% is important because 50% is very commonly considered as the possible threshold between a survivable and a non-survivable situation. That's why the NFPA 2112 test in the USA, which requires this test, requires a maximum predicted body burn of 50%. Now, of course, you may have been doing this for years. You may have been wearing primary FR workwear and putting disposable garments over it for a long time. And unfortunately, we do hear this in the PPE industry too often. We've been doing it this way for years and it's been okay so far. There was a ship in 1912, and I'm pretty sure that's what they were saying when they were speeding across the Atlantic on the bridge. So far, so good. We've been doing okay so far, and we know where that ended. You will only have this problem, you will only recognize it if you have a flash fire event, and if you have a comparison of what would the results have been if you hadn't been wearing the disposable clothing over it. So thinking that it's been okay so far is pretty short-sighted. The fact is, we've proved through that thermal mannequin testing, which is really useful testing, that by wearing a disposable or chemical suit over primary FR workwear, you can substantially increase the injury, the body burn, as a result of a flash fire. So you can't do it. So the question is, what do we do about it? How can we solve the problem? Well, the answer comes with secondary FR workwear. Now, it's important to understand that secondary FR workwear does not give FR protection. If you wear it on its own, it will give you no protection against flame and heat or flash fire at all. It's not designed to be worn on its own. What it's designed for is to provide other types of protection, such as chemical, but here's the key, without compromising thermal protection. So that's what we need in this situation. We need secondary FR workwear that actually works, that we know will not compromise thermal protection and will not increase body burn in the event of a flash fire. So, just 1 second. Just 1 or 2 questions coming, but I think I'll deal with them towards the end. So what do we do about this? So we need secondary FR workwear, but how do we know any secondary FR workwear will work, that it will do this, that it won't increase body burn? Well, let's look at the standards that we have at the moment, the standards for secondary FR workwear, and let's look at whether they solve the problem and whether they tell us the right information to make the judgment. And we're going to look at both USA standards and European standards briefly. I'm a big believer that our primary consideration here is protection. We don't follow standards and apply standards just because we have to legally, because they apply locally. We follow standards and apply them because they improve protection. And if you approach it from that way, then I think we should look at all standards, whether it's US standards or Europe, and choose what's best amongst them and apply them that way, because we should be getting maximum protection. But let's look at the 2 standards that apply in this case. In the USA, we have NFPA 2113. And in Europe, we have EN 14116. So first of all, in the USA, NFPA 2113 could be viewed as a partner standard to NFPA 2112. NFPA 2112 is for primary FR garments. 2113 relates to the selection, the use and the care of NFPA 2112 garments. And it refers to garments that are worn over your primary FR workwear, over the garments certified to NFPA 2112. Unfortunately, there's no testing defined. It doesn't define any testing to assess it. All it says on three different occasions in the standard is it references that in general, overgarments, i.e. garments that are worn over the primary FR workwear, must be flame resistant. That's all it says, essentially, which is great. It's a step forward, step in the right direction. So yeah, 5 points to NFPA for mentioning it, but hey, it doesn't define it and it doesn't provide any testing for it. So yeah, have the 5 points for mentioning it, but minus 10 for not actually defining it or providing testing for it. So that sort of contributes, but it's not a major help. What about EN 14116 in Europe? So EN 14116 is about the general assessment of FR clothing fabrics, and it provides a single test, a vertical flammability test that looks something like this. And basically, you take a sample of the fabric held vertically, and you apply a small flame to the center of it. In this case, to the center of it, in this specific test, it can also be applied to the bottom edge, but essentially you apply that flame to the center for 10 seconds and you see what happens to the fabric. Now, this test classifies fabrics into three types based on the results of that test. And they are index 1, 2, or 3. And secondary FR garments, garments worn over primary FR garments, should be at least index 1. And that means essentially that there should be no burning, it shouldn't ignite, and it shouldn't burn or melt to the edge of the sample. So once that flame applies, if the fabric burns to the edge, to any edge, or melts to any edge, or if there's any dripping, then it will fail and it can't be certified to that standard. So that is better than NFPA 2113. At least there is some testing there, and testing that confirms that the fabric is unlikely to ignite and continue burning. Well, the problem is, it's not actually testing these garments in the way that they are used in the real world. That is, as worn over primary FR workwear. There's no testing that looks at that at all. So my view is that the current standards in North America and Europe simply fail to provide effective testing for secondary FR workwear, which is a concern, or at least it was, because there's a new name in town for secondary FR workwear, and that name is ANSI, ANSI 203. Now, I'll confess here, this was actually introduced in 2018, but I only found out about it when I was in the USA 2 weeks ago. And when I looked into it, I was very encouraged. Now, ANSI is the American National Standard Institute, and this standard is the American National Standard for secondary single-use flame-resistant protective clothing for use over primary flame-resistant clothing. So it is specifically designed for testing of garments that are intended or may be worn over primary FR workwear. And it contains two required tests. First of all, there's a flammability test of the fabric, which is similar to that vertical flammability test I've just shown you in the European standard. But more importantly, it requires thermal mannequin testing of the layered systems to predict body burn in the way that we saw earlier in the presentation. So what it does is this. It requires two tests. First of all, it requires a test, one, on the primary FR garment alone, as we did before, to prove the point about wearing standard disposables over primary FR workwear. So that's the first test you do. Again, that's the baseline. And then it requires that you do the same test on where you test the garment that's going to be worn over the primary FR workwear as it's used, i.e. over the same primary FR workwear. So you do two tests, the second one being the layered system, and you have to do them at the same time. And it requires this. It requires two things, that the body burn of that layered ensemble, the second test, first of all, it must be less than 50%. 50% predicted body burn. That's the same as the basic requirement in NFPA 2112, and it relates to that concept that 50% is the sort of survivable, non-survivable threshold. But more importantly, it requires that the predicted body burn of that layered ensemble must not be more than 2% greater than the result of the primary FR garment alone. So that's exactly what we need for secondary FR workwear. ANSI 203 tests secondary FR workwear as it's used in the real world as a layered system over primary FR workwear. And secondly, it ensures that secondary FR workwear at least does not increase the body burn, not substantially, not more than 2%. So for the first time, we've got a standard in ANSI 203 which actually provides the testing needed for secondary FR workwear, which is great. Now, I know this is a North American standard. Like most North American standards, it's not compulsory, it's voluntary. But whether you were in North America or whether you were anywhere else, my suggestion for any garments that you wear over primary FR workwear would be that if you don't follow this precise standard as it is and apply it specifically, you should at least apply its principle. So if you're wearing garments for any reason over primary FR workwear, you need to have thermal mannequin testing of the primary FR garment on its own and the combination of the two garments to make sure that that secondary garment is not going to increase body burn and that it will not cause a hazard. Because you saw with the disposable, the test earlier on, just how much thermal mannequin, the thermal protection from the primary FR garment can be damaged by wearing the wrong garment over it. So you maybe don't need to apply the standard specifically, but I think it's worthwhile applying the principle and requiring that manufacturers of garments that may be worn over primary FR workwear should provide you with that type of testing so that you know that you're safe. So that's the main thing, I think, from this presentation. But I also want to cover a related but slightly different subject, and that is specifically about some FR disposables, some garments in the market that appear to be FR and appear that they should be okay to wear over a primary FR garment. But actually, when you examine them carefully, they're not quite what you might think they are. And I'm going to talk about three specific brands. But for fairly obvious reasons, I'm not going to name these brands. These are three major brands in the marketplace. They're global companies. I'm going to refer to them as brand A, brand B, and brand C. And what they all have in common is that they are polypropylene-based SMS or SMMS disposable coveralls, and they all have a chemical FR treatment applied to the fabric to try to make them FR and give them FR properties. But interestingly, if you examine the products and the information and the certification, they are not quite what they appear to be. So let's examine that. First of all, let's look at the flash fire testing that the manufacturers of each of these products provide, because they are big global manufacturers, so they should be providing us with that information to make sure these garments are safe and can be worn. So first of all, if we look at the flash fire testing provided by the manufacturer of brand A, and there isn't any. If it's been done, it's not been published. What about brand B? Yep, same again. There isn't any. Brand C, same thing. The manufacturers are not supplying any thermal mannequin testing, as we've shown previously, and as is in ANSI 203, at all. Now, if they've been done, and bear in mind, I say they're big companies, it's not like they can't afford it. If those tests have been done, they're not publishing them. I think that probably tells you something. But okay, what about the certification? These products, presumably, they are FR, so presumably they will at least be certified to EN 14116. You remember that requires that vertical flammability test. So what about brand A? Well, if we look at the data sheet, and I will say I checked all this information very recently to make sure it was updated, up to date. And in the data sheet, it says that the material is tested to ISO 15025. That is that vertical flammability test. And it says it complies with EN 14116 2008. Note that it doesn't say it's certified to, it says it complies with. And interestingly, 2008 is the old version of that standard. It's nearly 15 years old. That standard was revised in 2015, and a number of new requirements, specifically a requirement to test the components, the zip, the seams, as well as the fabric, were added. But it's only complying to the old version of the standard, apparently. But what about the actual certification? So I downloaded the CE certificate and was surprised to find there's no mention of EN 14116 at all, or any other FR standard for that matter. So basically, this brand A is not certified to any FR standard at all. What about brand B? Data sheet claims flame retardant, and it claims flame resistant treatment in another point on the data sheet. But when you download the certificate, again, no mention of EN 14116 or any other FR standard. Again, like brand A, brand B is not certified to any FR standard. Brand C, the label states that it is certified to EN 14116 2015. But actually, if you read the Declaration of Conformity, it says this, but it claims it's certified, but applicable to the fabric only. Well, as I said, the 2015 version of the standard specifically introduced new requirements for testing of the components of the zip and the seams, and it specifically requires, for obvious reasons, that the zip must function at least once after the test. But this is to the fabric only. My understanding was that you can't certify to part of the standard, but this brand C appears to be certified to a bit of the standard, part of it. So, okay, let's give that one the benefit of the doubt and at least put a question mark. But the point is, lots of people in the market, they were very commonly sold. Interestingly, I was told a couple of weeks ago that they're not actually sold in North America now, probably because of that new ANSI 203 standard. But these are very commonly sold in the rest of the world. But actually, if you look at them, the FR claims are certainly not backed up by proper certification. So, okay, we thought, let's look more into these products and let's do some independent flash fire testing of these garments, like we did before. So first of all, we did this 2 or 3 years ago. We did a flash fire test, that thermal mannequin test, on a standard SMS product worn over primary FR workwear. So this is the version of this garment that's not FR treated. It's the standard plastic disposable coverall, and the resulting body burn was 24.5%. Now we'll note that's different figures to the previous ones. That's because the parameters of this test were different. We chose for various reasons, we chose a shorter burn in this test, so the body burn level is lower. But it's the comparison of body burn that's important. So that was the first test on the non-FR treated garment. And then we repeated that test with the FR version of the same garment, the one that's treated as FR and claims to be flame resistant. And the result was this, 19.6. Hey, it's lower, but it's less than 1% lower. And interestingly, there's still second and third degree burns. And actually, if you look at the proportions, we found that the third degree burns in the second test were actually more than in the first test. So what's that telling you? It's telling you that, okay, one has an FR treatment, but when it comes to how these garments are actually used in the real world, you're not really getting any difference in performance between the FR version and the non-FR version. So just summarizing the points about those FR garments that are in the marketplace right now, and the big brands, the manufacturers are not providing any body burn prediction tests, any flash fire testing. I think that tells us something. Brand A and Brand B are not certified to any FR standard. Brand C apparently is certified, but it's ignoring the requirements that were introduced in the 2015 standard. And finally, the independent testing that we've done suggests there's almost no difference in the performance between the FR and the non-FR version. So the question I would ask is, what are you paying for? Because you will pay more for the FR version than the non-FR, but you're not really getting any difference in performance. So what I would say, one of the takeaways I would hope is that if you are using these FR disposables, then I would suggest that you go away and have a look at the detail, have a look at what it says in the data sheet, have a look at how they are certified and whether they are certified to an FR standard at all, and then make decisions accordingly on that. Because maybe you need to find something better that is proven to work. So I'm going to draw some conclusions now. I think you've listened to me for long enough. But what have we learned from this? I think there are 4 key things. First of all, you really cannot wear standard disposables or chemical suits over primary FR clothing. You can't do it. We saw in the testing that you can critically damage the FR protection that you get from the primary FR clothing. So if you are doing that, you are putting workers at risk of serious injury. Second, the only effective way to assess any garment that you're going to wear over primary FR workwear is through thermal mannequin testing. It's not cheap, it's an expensive test, but it's a lot cheaper than having somebody seriously burned. The thermal mannequin testing predicts likely body burn in a flash fire situation. It's the only method in use that tests these garments as they are used in the real world. And it's the only one that will actually give you a good indication of whether the secondary FR garments, the garment worn over the primary FR workwear, will increase body burn and constitute a hazard. So it's really important that we have that testing applied more for these types of garments. Third thing, the existing standards that we've had for garments worn over primary FR workwear have been very limited. In fact, I would say largely inadequate for testing of FR clothing layered systems. We do have this new standard, ANSI 203, which does provide the information you need to know that you are safe. And I would say, even if you don't apply that specific standard, do require that principle of testing the layered system and getting a comparison with the primary FR garment alone, so that you know that your secondary garment is not going to increase body burn. So even if you don't apply the standard, please apply the principle. Require the manufacturers to get that information for you. And finally, a note about these FR SMS garments. I've had concerns about them for a long time. As I say, I was told they are rarely sold in North America now. We looked at 3 specific brands. As I say, for obvious reasons, I'm not going to name them, but if anyone wants to contact me afterwards, I can point you to the information where you can confirm all this. They are not certified, or at least not certified properly. One of them seems to be partly certified to any FR standards. There's no manufacturer's flash fire testing provided, and the testing that we've done indicates that there's very little difference in performance between the FR and the non-FR versions. So I'm going to draw to a conclusion now. If you remember, I started with a promise or an intention to convince you of three things. And that was that existing PPE standards fail to address this issue. Hopefully I've done that by pointing out that none of the existing ones until ANSI 203 address these garments as they are worn in the real world. Secondly, this new ANSI standard, it does precisely what is needed for this type of situation. So even if you don't use the standard, do apply its principle. And secondly, some secondary FR garments are not what you think they are. Hopefully with the analysis I've given you, I proved that. But finally, I want to leave you with one more slide. I'm not going to talk about this slide much. I'm going to show you it and I'll let you draw your own conclusions, and then we'll head into a question and answer session. So we saw the difference in the FR and the non-FR SMS garments in the body burn test. Very little difference, 20.5 to 19.6. At Lakeland, we produce our own range of secondary FR clothing that is a different type of material and is specifically engineered to have FR properties. And at the same time we did these tests on these two SMS garments, we tested our similar garments, which give the same protection and are specifically designed to wear as secondary FR workwear. And the results we got were these. So I'll let you draw your own conclusions from that, and then we shall head into a question and answer session. So please, I shall have a look at the screen, see what questions we have already, and please enter any questions that you have, and I'll do my best to answer. And thank you. So I'll just have a look at what questions we've got here. We've got a lot of good mornings. Why? We've got a question from to everyone. Robert, my colleague Robert in Poland has answered. He asked, why normal coveralls cause more burn injury? Well, I think Robert's answered, but I'll just go over that again. Normal coveralls, we're referring to disposable coveralls. So type 5 and 6 are the disposable coveralls that are worn the world over just for general light splash and spray protection or dust protection. And we're also talking about type 3 and 4 chemical suits. All of these products are made of plastic. They are polypropylene and polyethylene, which means they will burn. In the event of a flash fire or contact with a flame, they will ignite and they will continue to burn. They are very good fuel for fire. So if you're wearing one of those over a primary FR garment and there's a flash fire, the flash fire will only last 2 or 3 seconds. But if you're engulfed in that flash fire, whilst that will extinguish after a couple of seconds, the material of your outer garment, your disposable garment, will continue to burn. It will ignite and it will continue to burn. And it's plastic, so it drips and it sticks to the fabric of the primary FR workwear, and it continues to sit there burning. And it can continue for 20, 30, 40 seconds or more. And all the time it's transferring heat through to the skin of the wearer. What's worse about it is that because it's plastic, it sticks. So in normal circumstances, one of the things you do is try and wrap or roll people to put the fire out if the clothing is on fire. But if it's plastic, all that does is spread it around. You know, I was once foolishly playing with matches and these disposable fabrics to see how they reacted to fire. And I got a little drop of burning plastic on the back of my hand. So I went like that to put it out. And then I had another little bit of burning plastic on the palm of my hand there, and it hurt because that type of plastic is good at holding heat energy and releasing it over time. So the result of that, because it sticks to the fabric and continues to burn, it will transfer the heat through. And your primary FR garment is simply not designed to protect against that sort of contact with fire. So the result will be an increased level of body burn. So I hope that explains that one. Okay, so that's jumped around a bit. Hang on 1 second. There is a good question here from Peter Hebblethwaite. The material for secondary FR workwear needs to be looked at. Otherwise, if too heavy, worker comfort, body temperature rates could be negatively affected. That's true. That is true. Yes. And ideally, as with all protective clothing, it needs to be as breathable as possible and as light as possible, because of course, heat exhaustion is another hazard in itself. However, we're looking at a situation where people have to wear 2 layers of clothing anyway. So they have to have the primary FR protection, but they also need chemical protection over it. Or as I said earlier, quite often people are just wearing a lightweight disposable garment over the primary FR workwear to keep it clean and lengthen its life. So it's a good point, but the issue that we're talking about here is FR protection, and choosing the outer garment comes down to, it depends on what type of protection you need. With some types of chemical protection, you simply cannot have a breathable fabric because it won't provide the chemical barrier. But certainly with certain types of type 5 and 6 protection, there are some that are much more breathable than others. In general, the SMS types are very breathable, but also the 2 products there, Pyralon XT and Pyralon Plus 2 there, they are very breathable fabrics and they provide the type 5 and 6 protection that's needed. But yeah, obviously comfort is a very important issue. So we've got, so Monica Heinig, I trust the combination of the tested FR garment with the materials used for the FR garment. Yes, yeah, obviously that baseline of testing the FR garment alone, the level of protection that you get will depend on the quality of that garment. Obviously, some primary FR garments give better protection than others. In general, it relates to the weight and the density. Heavier, very dense fabrics tend to give better FR protection. But that is precisely why in that ANSI 203 test, it doesn't define what precise, I may be wrong on this, actually, thinking about it, but think of it in a different way. If you're doing that test for ANSI 203, or just to establish the principle, it almost doesn't matter which primary FR garment you use, as long as you use a primary FR garment and then use the same primary FR garment for the second test with the disposable worn over it. Because what is important is the difference between the two, comparison. And that ANSI test, the ANSI standard, requires that the result of wearing the outer garment over the primary FR workwear does not increase the body burn by more than 2%. So yes, the primary FR workwear garment is important in the level of body burn that you get, but in this context, in the testing, the important thing is that you use the same primary FR garment. So you need a baseline with the FR garment on its own, and then a second test to compare and make sure that the outer garment doesn't increase the body burn. Somebody has asked if we can get a copy of the slides. Yes, I don't see any reason why I can't put that online. I have to think about how I can do that. But also there will be a recording of this presentation available as well, hopefully in a few days. Any more questions right now? What sort of things does the zip testing include? Heat transference and melting. Okay, so the only thing that this can relate to is the testing EN 14116 standard. Remember I said that standard was revised and republished in 2015, and before the 2015, in the 2008 version, basically it was a requirement for the fabric to be tested and that the fabric doesn't burn and melt and so on. There was a general reference to components, but it wasn't specific. The main change in the 2015 version is that it specifically required the same test, that vertical flammability test, to be done on any components as well as the fabric. including the zip and seams and anything else that might be used in the manufacture of the garment. And specifically with the zip, it requires that the zip has the zip and the components must meet the same requirements in terms of not igniting and burning and melting, but also it requires that the zip must function at least once after the test. Now, in terms of heat transference, so I think you're referring here to heat transfer tests, which are required in the primary FR workwear standard, EN 11612 and in NFPA 2112, which is measuring the resistance of the fabric to transfer of heat energy through, because it's the transfer of heat energy, the rate and the amount of heat energy that's transferred that results in a burn. But that vertical flammability test does not have any heat resistance transference element to it. It is purely to measure the flammability of the fabric and the components, not heat transference. So there's no heat transference required in that test. Heat transference resistance comes into the primary FR workwear standards. Peter says, thanks for the presentation. Very interesting. That's good to hear. I was a bit worried it was getting very boring, actually, 3/4 of the way through, but that's probably just me. I think it looks like, okay, so we've also got some one or two things on the chat. So Darby Perber, my good friend Darby, please advise best end user customer industry to inform and promote more on this issue. Well, as I said at the beginning, this is an issue that could be in any industry. It can always be the case that you need both FR protection and chemical protection, or to wear a disposable coverall over the FR protection. But I think the industry where it is most common and can be a pretty standard requirement is in oil and gas. I know in the USA we sell a lot of the pyralon garments into refineries, but it's also a very common need in petrochemical and any chemical plant. Again, the key is you need both types of protection at the same time. And the danger is that people assume that you can just wear a standard disposable over the primary FR garment because then you got both protections. But you can't, because as we've seen, that will damage and possibly seriously damage the FR protection provided by the primary FR coverall. So I would say focus, this is something that should be of interest, particularly in the oil and gas industry and specifically refining and petrochemical. So we've got Nalia Kanan asking, Pyralon +2 can be suitable for 100% polyester fabric. Well, I'm not entirely sure what that means. What I will say is that Pyralon +2 is not polyester fabric. All the Pyralon garments are based on a completely different technology. They are based on actually a viscose material. It's essentially wood pulp, part of it, which means, and the way it works is that it actually chars at a temperature below its ignition point. So it chars rather than burns. So it doesn't drip. It doesn't continue to burn. As soon as you withdraw the flame, it just stops. Mohammed Abdul Karim has asked, when performance is not much for fire protection, so why oil and gas industries buy this disposable coverall? Well, this is the point that I'm trying to make, and a really important point from this is this issue of wearing disposable clothing, disposable coveralls, the standard plastic-based ones, over FR protection. And I think in quite a lot of the parts of the world, it's still the situation that people are doing this unknowingly. So our job in the safety industry and our job as manufacturers in Lakeland is to educate people, and we've got to get to people and show them this type of information and show them why you cannot wear standard disposable coveralls over FR protection, because you're simply going to destroy the FR protection. It means essentially you don't have the FR protection, or at least you've severely reduced it. Okay. I think that may, I can't see any other questions that I've missed, unless anyone else has anything. Just looking back. Just going back to that question about that was asked about what the testing of the zip. It also mentioned melting. Yeah, that vertical flammability test, the three things really that it looks at are, firstly, that it doesn't ignite, that it doesn't burn to the edge of the sample, and also that it doesn't drip molten debris, is the phrase that is used, so that it doesn't melt and drip. And interestingly, going back to those FR SMS garments, we've done sort of separate testing in-house, as it were, and videoed it, and quite often those FR SMSs still drip molten material. So, any more questions? It looks like that's it. It looks like you're all satisfied, which is good. So I think we'll draw to a close. So I would say thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope it's been interesting. And the one thing I would say is this is a serious issue. You know, the issues like if you're wearing standard disposable clothing, FR over FR clothing, or if you know people that are, they may have a problem and it needs looking at. It's a danger, it's a risk to workers. And that's possibly the main thing to take from this presentation, that you need to find something that actually works. And it's that thermal mannequin testing that actually will tell you that it is safe to wear types of clothing over primary FR workwear. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. And I look forward to the opportunity to talk to you again. Thank you very much indeed.